Here today, the U.S. Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines are joined together in a common effort to help this country. Responding to the request of the Republic of Vietnam, the United States has come to help.
What happens to Vietnam will depend in the end on who wins the villages. And the government of the United States has determined that it won't be communist guerrillas.
On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnam's tanks rolled into the South Vietnam capital of Saigon, marking the end of the Vietnam War. The U.S. was forced to withdraw. The devastating war lasted almost 2 decades, leaving millions dead, including 58,000 Americans, 250,000 South Vietnamese allies, and an estimated 3 million communist fighters and civilians. Celebrations marking the anniversary of the end of the war culminated in a grand parade in Ho Chi Minh City. Thousands of troops marched and onlookers eagerly cheered on the festivities. NBC's Janice McAffrey reports from Vietnam.
It's been 50 years since the fall of Saigon, when North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops rolled into the city and took the presidential palace here, bringing an end to the Vietnam War, a conflict that led to the deaths of millions of Vietnamese people and more than 50,000 American soldiers. Every year, Liberation Day, as it's called here, is marked with a celebration, but this was their biggest display yet. A military parade featuring 13,000 soldiers and performers, jets and helicopters flying overhead, all for people crowded onto the streets, as well as a delegation that included a small contingent of representatives from the United States. The Trump administration appearing to ease an order that was given to senior diplomats in Vietnam to not attend the events here. The ambassador was not expected to attend, but Susan Burns, the consul general here in Ho Chi Minh City, was spotted on the stage just hours after the State Department dodged a question about why diplomats were told that they shouldn't attend. For the U.S. here, the war came down to a few final frantic hours with the evacuation of the remaining Americans and several Vietnamese from the U.S. Embassy here. Several veterans travel back from the U.S. every year for the anniversary. Some have returned to Vietnam and just stayed. Matthew Keenan now lives in Da Nang, where he volunteers at a center that helps Vietnamese victims of Agent Orange, the toxic defoliant that was used by U.S. forces during the war and what he believes caused his cancer.
The boys and girls who I talked about before, they cannot explain why they have a problem. They cannot explain about a war. They can't explain about toxic chemicals. I can. And I do that for them.
The U.S. and Vietnam now have what's called a comprehensive strategic partnership. It's a very high level of diplomatic relations, which is rooted in post-war reconciliation, but now has more strategic purpose given regional competition with China. But here today, for people on the streets, with or without Americans, this is a day of national pride to mark a communist victory in Vietnam that reshaped the world and Vietnam's place in it.
Now, more than half a century later, we are sharing the stories of those directly impacted, from soldiers on the ground to those living in the war zone who were injured, killed, or forced to flee. Christine Pace spoke to retired U.S. Army General Barry McAffrey about his experience serving in the war.
Today marks 50 years since the fall of Saigon, leading to the definitive end of the Vietnam War. On April 30th, 1975, Saigon fell to northern Vietnam forces. Thousands of Americans and South Vietnamese were evacuated from the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, with many refugees arriving here in the U.S. Joining us now to discuss this historic moment is retired U.S. Army General Barry McAffrey. And General, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that you were awarded multiple decorations for your extensive service in Vietnam. From myself and everyone here at King 5, we want to thank you for your service.
Thank you.
So as we look at the images of the evacuation 50 years later, it's hard to think about we are already here, how do they resonate with you now, especially as a veteran?
Well, obviously it was an immense tragedy. It went on for years. It ended up killing 59,000 plus American troops, over 303,000 wounded, 75,000 of them badly maimed. Never mind the terrible loss of life among the Vietnamese. So although it was a tragedy, it was also a statement on the power of the Constitution. Year after year, we drafted hundreds of thousands of young men and sent them into combat, and they complied with the directives of the president, supported by the Congress of the United States. So it's a mixed memory, I'm sure, in most of the veterans out here that will watch this interview.
General, this is considered also the largest helicopter evacuation in history. Can you tell us about the sheer scope of evacuating thousands from the embassy? When we see the video, we see the pictures, it was a very intense moment.
Well, yeah, it was, no question. They put out Bing Crosby playing White Christmas over the Armed Forces radio. That was the network coded call, get to an evacuation point. But I must remind you that by and large, the armed forces, which at the max deployment capacity, we had over 500,000 troops in Vietnam. They were gone. So it was primarily the CIA, the State Department, USAID, and other agencies, and reporters and people working in Saigon that were trying to get out. Most of them did, not all of them. It was a very chaotic scene.
Absolutely. And Joe, if you can quickly remark on this, when we think of the legacy, thousands of Vietnamese refugees arrived in the U.S., leading to Little Saigon enclaves and communities across America, including here in Seattle. Why is it important to remember this historic day that led to all of this?
Well, certainly the best thing that came out of the Vietnam War, bar none, was the hundreds of thousands, more than 1 million Vietnamese who came to this country and who have their children in particular now are helping run it. So it's an incredibly impressive culture, a work ethic, a family-oriented group, and America benefited from having those who fled communism at the risk of their life by sea and jungle through Laos and Cambodia, and now are American citizens.
In your later years in your service, you helped shape U.S. military policy. When we think back, what lessons have we all learned from the fall of Saigon that are still relevant today? I can't help but think of armed conflicts in Afghanistan and the withdrawal of the troops in 2021, and even the current war in Ukraine.
Yeah, well, there's no question that that Vietnam was a great tragedy. It consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. To include 49,000 American troops killed and 300,000 plus wounded. I think the political lesson of it is that the civilian leadership of the country, when they commit the armed forces to battle, has to understand the objectives they're trying to achieve, and then use any amount of resources, force, soft power, intelligence, allies, to achieve their objective. So I think what ended the American support for the Vietnam War wasn't the terrible loss of life. It was a growing conclusion by the American people that the government did not know what they were doing. And I don't think they did.
You know, when we think of the current administration and Trump's sort of involvement with the war in Ukraine and the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, how did the war in Vietnam and the way it ended affect your views on future American interventions?
Well, Ukraine, of course, is a very special case. It's a sovereign country. It's one of the largest countries in Europe. It's fighting for its survival against naked Russian aggression, which has seized Crimea a few years back and now is trying to gobble the whole country. It's widely supported by all of our European allies. The Ukrainians are willing to fight and die for their own freedom. They want to be part of Europe. So I think it is somewhat different than Vietnam, where North and South Vietnam were fated to eventually be reunified. They were the same people. Not so in Ukraine.
Absolutely. And finally, General, kind of going back to the fall of Saigon 50 years ago today, when you see the images, I can't help but think about this. They're very, very intense, and it was a very emotional time as well. At the time, during the throes of the war, did you even imagine that that moment would happen? And when you look at these pictures now, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's important for me to lay down a marker. The end of South Vietnam came when Congress said no more money. At that point, it was patently clear to the South Vietnamese armed forces and the people that they would succumb to a very aggressive, well-led North Vietnamese army backed by the Russians and the Chinese. So Congress pulled the rug out from under the South Vietnam. It was a political decision, which is appropriate for Congress, and that's what caused that evacuation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you very much, General Barry McAffrey, for your insights. 50 years later, we so appreciate it. Thank you.
Good to be with you.
When we come back, hear the personal stories of those who came to the U.S. to escape the war and build a new community here in Western Washington. Welcome back. 50 years after the war ended, the Washington State History Museum has opened a new exhibit in Tacoma. It showcases keepsakes, photos, and personal items from Vietnam veterans in Washington. The war had a big impact on our state. More than 180,000 Vietnam veterans came from Washington, and more than 300,000 troops trained at Fort Lewis before deploying to Vietnam. The museum hopes the exhibit will offer a unique perspective.
I think a really interesting aspect of this exhibition is to see these items that troops brought home with them, not only brought with them through their travels and their deployment, but kept for 50 years.
The exhibit will be on display until mid-November. And now we hear from Eric Wilkinson, who talked to a woman who escaped South Vietnam in the midst of war. She now is helping other refugees relocate to a place that she calls home.
Excuse me.
Van Dien Kuno remembers the fall of Saigon like a war movie in slow motion.
You see the dead body laying on the street, in the gutter.
She was just 17 years old when North Vietnamese forces took the city, setting her family scrambling to escape.
My father is just desperate to have the family get out safely.
Van's family of 11 made it to a crowded boat. This document proving her father's military service for the United States, securing them a spot. They sailed for 11 days, dodging rocket fire, running out of fuel and food, surviving on rainwater when they were rescued by the U.S. Navy.
I remember really well. You know, all of a sudden you feel so much better. You feel, you know, you're no longer sick. You're no longer sad. You think you see hope there.
Van and her family arrived with literally nothing but the clothes on their backs. A church in Minnesota agreed to sponsor them.
They wrote it by hand.
Church members provided this handwritten survival guide for a new life in America. They housed and fed the family until they got on their feet. Van's gratitude is real today as it was then.
When you lose everything, you know, you lose your house, you lose your future.
50 years later, part of Van is still that young refugee welcome to the shores of America. Now she's paying it forward here at Everett Community College.
Hi, how's you?
For the past 34 years, Van has run Refugee and Immigrant Services Northwest, helping new arrivals to this country assimilate. Her life coming full circle.
To make sure the people come after me had the same opportunity like I have to be a successful, to be a productive citizen in this country.
And while today's America may not seem as welcoming to immigrants as it did 50 years ago, Van's love for this country has not faltered.
United States of America is still the best place to live. I want to take this opportunity to let American people know I am thankful for you.
Eric Wilkinson, King 5 News.
A Snohomish woman has overcome immense adversity to open a veterans retreat center. Multiple sclerosis left her a quadriplegic, and her husband, a Vietnam veteran, died by suicide. King 5's Maddie White shares her mission of healing.
Healing hearts through nature.
The mountain is a great place to heal.
It's what Teresa Flying Eagle Baird made her life mission.
I was so depressed because my kids were sad.
After needing some serious healing of her own.
And we started reading the literature, and his behavior was all the signs.
Really?
You know.
Of PTSD?
Yeah.
In 1987, her husband Bill died by suicide.
He was seeing the jungle alongside the road and hallucinating.
That same year, she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. It left her quadriplegic. But not even that would stop her from sharing the gift of healing in nature.
To hike, to camp, or just be by yourself, or be with your family.
Their front sign says it all. Healing Hearts off Mountain Loop Highway is a place specifically for veterans who are dealing with war zone stress or who are reintegrating back into life at home. Her husband, Bill, was not her only motivation for starting Healing Hearts. Her high school boyfriend, Bob Hoskins, died in combat in Vietnam.
Did you love him? Oh, I'm so sorry.
Now, 50 years after the fall of Saigon, she's reflecting on the evolution of how our culture has treated its veterans.
We've learned a lot about PTSD. It's acceptable. It used to be you were considered weak. Well, no, anybody that goes through trauma is going to have something.
It's why, by healing hearts, Teresa's in some ways healing her own.
The land was beautiful, and I think it was a gift from God.
Maddie White, King 5 News.
A community advocate and a UW researcher are working to make sure the history of a cultural hub in Seattle is preserved, and they are doing it through art. That's ahead. Welcome back. Many people fled to the U.S. after Saigon fell. Little Saigon in Seattle became a regional community hub for some as Vietnamese businesses opened in the area. On New Day Northwest, Kelly Hansen speaks to the creators of a short film that tells the story of how this neighborhood came to be.
My hopes and dreams are to kind of unfold the layers of this neighborhood. It's not this one-dimensional or like kind of stereotype of what it means to be Vietnamese.
A new short film tells the story of how Seattle's Little Saigon neighborhood came to be. It's called Saigon to Seattle, 50 Years After the War. Its premiere is one of several events planned around the Seattle area to commemorate the fall of Saigon and the end of the Vietnam War. Joining me now are two people who worked on the film, On Nguyen with Friends of Little Saigon, and John L. Tran, a researcher and PhD student at the University of Washington. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having us.
So John, I want to start with you. Can you talk about the significance of this anniversary for the Vietnamese community in King County?
Yeah, so for many, the April 30th is considered the fall of Saigon. For others, it's considered the day we lost our country, and yet there are others that consider it Liberation Day. So, and the reality is that this is all true. So what it is a day of shared experience. And for the Vietnamese Americans here in the Seattle area, it's a day for us, a day of reflection for us to reflect on where we came from, the places that we came from, and where we will go in the future.
Definitely. And what drew Vietnamese refugees to the Seattle neighborhood now known as the Little Saigon?
Well, really the first waves of Vietnamese Americans who came to the state of Washington were relocated throughout the state. So over time, there was a migration to the economic center of the state, being Seattle, and subsequent waves would then reestablish themselves here in Seattle through sponsorships and other avenues.
Yeah, and at the time in Yes Little Terrace, there were also a huge population of Vietnamese and Southeast Asian refugees who settled there, which led to Little Saigon, with its proximity to Yes Little Terrace, becoming the main commercial core for the Vietnamese community.
Wow, and in working on this film and listening to all the stories, what themes emerged?
Yeah, we saw that there were themes of, in the beginning, hardship through war, through assimilation and the forces of assimilation. And then that eventually progressed to a theme of perseverance. There was a real desire to thrive in this new home. And finally, we found that there was a lot of hope for the future of the community.
Yeah, and with that hope is also the drive to preserve the culture for future generations and to preserve the language and the practices of the Vietnamese culture as well.
And why is it so important to document these stories and this history?
So the stories and the experiences of Vietnamese refugees and South Vietnamese members of the refugee community here are not often shared in textbooks or in media related to the Vietnam War. So we feel like it's important for us to share those stories and to make sure that they don't just exist as oral histories that will fade over time. Also, a lot of Vietnamese refugees, through the pain of loss and trauma of being through the war, they often don't talk about their past. So many of their stories go untold, and a lot of second and third generation Vietnamese Americans don't know about the histories of their parents or grandparents. So we hope that through sharing these stories in our project, it will inspire folks to start new dialogues and to help them move through their journey of healing and understanding.
Absolutely. And the film premieres on May 3rd, which is super exciting. So tell me about that and then the other events that you guys have planned that is coming up.
Yeah. So obviously, this is just one of the many events that are happening in Seattle. And for Friends of Little Saigon, we're hoping to premiere our film on May 3rd at Hoa Mai Park, the first public green space in the Little Saigon neighborhood. And along with the film, we'll also be sharing a booklet that accompanies the film. It'll feature more of the research that John did. It'll tell you more about all of the different folks that we interviewed for the project. And outside the film and the booklet, we'll be showcasing some art. Right now on view, you can see an exhibit at the Little Saigon Creative, curated by Tan Tan, focusing on veterans who fought in the final battle of the Vietnam War. And we also have an exhibit on view at Yuan Ru Art Center in Bellevue, featuring art by local artists, 9 artists and 9 storytellers, making work about their experience and their families' experiences of the Vietnam War.
Wow. Well, I'm so glad you both were here today. Thank you so much for sharing your story and your passion and the film with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us to remember the Vietnam War and the fall of Saigon. For King 5 Plus, I'm Joyce Taylor.